Welcome to the PI Podcast, Political Insights for the Palaging Inis. I'm your host, Matt, and with me is political scientist, meme lord, and baby fish from the river destined to bring about a change in Philippine democracy, Borge.
Baby fish. Now I remembered baby shark.
Can you say, let our people go, Borge?
Let our
Anyway,
people go. PI nyo,
all right.
PI nating lahat. Board here at your service.
Yes, welcome to episode 10. And it's
Ooh.
been a long time. We started out, I suppose, last September, and now it's been, what, 5 or 6 months?
Yeah.
And we have a special announcement just before we head to our episode. We have just, according to Spotify for podcasters, we have just reached and exceeded the 1,000 play mark for the PI podcast. Woo!
Nice.
Yeah, more than 1,000. Well, it took us a bit longer than most, but we're getting there. And actually, not just more than 1,000 plays, but also more than 500 listeners. So,
Nice.
my God, our army is growing. Say something for our new army.
Yep.
Mga PI
Maraming salamat mga ka-PI. Sana'y patuloy ang inyong pakikinig.
Mhm. And keep on listening. We highly appreciate it. And if you want to say hi, just say hi in the comments or send us an email at pipodcastph@gmail.com, all lowercase.
Yep.
So of course today is a very special day. Why is that, Borge?
Because I read a book.
We all read the books. You read a book every day. No, there's a special day. Or unless you're being a Scrooge about this. I don't know. Come on. Bah, humbug. Yeah. All right. What is today?
The 35th anniversary of the EDSA People Power Revolution, as far as official records are concerned.
I mean, technically, we're releasing this after, but we are recording it on this day. How was your 35th anniversary? I mean, you notice anything? Yeah.
I just looked at my memories on Facebook, and I said that it was a mere footnote in the Philippine oligarchy, which I should have reposted, but not this year. I reposted something else. What about you? What did you do for today's events?
I just remember that it is one of the. It's a tragic event where our great leader Marcos was cast aside by these greedy oligarchs. Joke. No, I'm kidding. But
I'm supposed to be a pro Marcos.
Whoa, we are both pro Marcos. No, I'm kidding.
No.
Is, of course, I find this to be a very emotional and very, quite frankly, it's a difficult day to reflect on, to be honest. Well, not so difficult because on the one hand, besides of course being 35th anniversary of EDSA, this is the 35th anniversary of my parents officially being romantically linked together. So oddly enough, my dad popped the question, like not necessarily to be married yet, but to be boyfriend and girlfriend to my mom. Yeah, literally. And while everyone else was fighting for freedom, they were holding hands and
Also fighting for freedom.
establishing their relationship, their own freedom. And if they didn't have self-control, I probably would have been conceived. Seriously, it's a special day for them. It's basically, it's not the wedding anniversary, but they count +3. So they've been married 32 years, then +3, counting on EDSA Day, that they consider this their official anniversary. So
wow. Araw pala ng jowa ngayon.
Oh yeah, and it's funny. My birthday was also on an election when Ramos was elected. So I suppose that's like literally on that day.
Yeah, you were born to be a political scientist.
Almost, yeah. My God. So there's that. But at the same time, since this was way before you and I were born, we've heard so much about it, and we've learned about it even as political scientists more than most people. Even as early as grade school, it's in our textbooks. It's for freedom. And do you remember back in Ayala Museum? Like I've been there through the entire thing at least twice. On both times, be a field trip. No wait, one field trip, one on by myself. On both times, I passed through this chamber like it's almost as if it's like a Clockwork Orange kind of thing, with this chamber wherein they play clips of Batas Militar, which is that
Yeah.
documentary about EDSA revolution, and it was like a weird experience where it's like drilling it into me. So yeah, how many times? Well, officially I've been there twice, so I technically watched Batas Militar twice, plus three more times by a lazy Civica teacher back in across grade school. So it's been drilled into me. So I have a certain version of the EDSA revolution. Uh, what about you? Do you remember
Yeah.
anything? Any memories? Yeah.
The thing is, well, regarding memories, again, we must recognize that EDSA is a generation from us. So it's not our generation. We are post EDSA babies, if you would call it that way. So
What did your parents do during EDSA? My parents got together first of all. What do you? What do
I,
you?
I think my mom stayed at home and my dad tried to organize a pro Marcos rally along with the family.
Oh,
So
what?
I know I think I mentioned this one during our martial law special, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's the story. So, but
Mm-hmm.
personally, my experience with EDSA is that it's constant
Mm-hmm.
story being told uh, during our civics. That's one thing. So from grade school
Right.
until high school, yeah, until high school,
Mm-hmm.
it's always part of Philippine history that this narrative of EDSA of,
Mm-hmm.
of people rallying behind the Aquinos. I think that's the basic notion,
Mm-hmm.
basic story behind it. Then you have multiple, which we call spin-offs, that you would say, but elaborations. But
Spin-offs.
that's basically the crux of it. So
Right. It's funny. This is us as students, being indoctrinated with this narrative into our
mm,
minds. But eventually, both of us, of course, became teachers of politics. I was
mm.
wondering how, just before we head into it, how you changed your approach or
yeah,
as a educator, about EDSA.
that's one thing. Well, before I answer that one, I must recognize that while formal education
Mm-hmm.
is trying to drill this narrative, this story of EDSA, I my upbringing is in a pro Marcos household, so I have access
Mm-hmm.
to two stories,
Mm-hmm.
two stories of EDSA. One
Mm-hmm.
in the from the vantage point of those in it, the other from the
Mm-hmm.
vantage point of those who are not part of EDSA and those who are pro Marcos. So I have access to both perspectives, and it took me a while to try to make sense of those, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that affected how I eventually handle EDSA during class. And
Mm-hmm.
you know what? Probably I'll ask you the same question, but how the hell how do we handle? I mean, we both of us taught city golf and eventually
Mm-hmm.
citizenship. Eventually, we would tackle EDSA, but
Right.
for me, I always recognize the values in it. It is a
Mm-hmm.
social movement. I would agree.
Mm-hmm.
It is a social. It is a popular movement. I would dare say that it is one of the first populist movements. The seeds of populism was probably planted in EDSA, but that's a controversial idea. I would require more time to analyze that one.
Yeah, it's a fair
Uh,
point. Yeah.
but it is a popular movement. It's
Mm-hmm.
a mass
Right.
movement at the very least.
Okay.
But
Mm-hmm.
there are pitfalls behind it that
Mm-hmm.
I also expose to my students. So I recognize it. I don't present a narrative of EDSA as a myth. I present it as an event with all its flaws
Mm.
and advantages.
Yes,
What
yes.
about you? How would you handle EDSA? How do you handle EDSA in your classes?
Mm. Well, to be quite frank, because I have been so saturated there, like I kind of took it for granted, and I assumed that
Mm,
people, like especially much earlier in my teaching career, I pretty much assumed it as a fact, as a given, and of course, like I ate it up, hook, line, and sinker. Like the meaning behind, not just the event, but the meaning behind it. Like it is it's expression of
mm,
democracy. It planted the seeds of, at least nominally, liberal democracy. And in a way, so in a sense, I brushed through it and I presumed it. And anyone who had something different,
mm,
were just insane. But as it turned out, like as I had more conversations with people like you and like people like, uh, well, Marcos apologists.
mm,
Like apparently, they have valid accounts of in a way not being included in EDSA or not really totally agreeing with EDSA. How they still wish Marcos
mm,
was back, and while I still don't agree, I still more or less hold that it is something that is important to consider. Besides, of course, as an event, I treat it as something still that needs to be reflected on. But in my classes, I tend to leave it as an open question rather than really hammer something into it. But before we move on, since we have different things, just to, in case that we have international listeners or listeners that are not familiar with our Philippine history, the EDSA People Power Revolution, quote unquote, is an event where citizens took to the streets and protested against the dictator Marcos after more than 2 or 3 decades
Yeah, two
of
decades. More than two
oh,
decades.
yeah, 2 decades of dictatorial rule, of autocratic rule. And so there are many, I mean, we're not going to discuss like the entire history of it. So basically, it is emblematic or as a success story of democratic politics here in the Philippines. But as this was deployed in our classes, in our museums, in public television, there are also alternative interpretations, like how it was a bad thing, like how it was a product of how do we say this, of backroom deals, how it was a Filipino moment, but it was only technically a few happened on a few stretch of kilometers of road, in Metro Manila. So what about Visayas, Mindanao? Of course, there's some people that say that there's some pockets of people like echoing that sentiment, but it's not the entire Philippines. So it's a something that is blown out of proportion. And so this is what we're going to discuss for episode 10, which is basically why is the EDSA a myth?
Yeah.
So, and what should we do about it? And what we say, well, take note, when we say myth, it's not mean we're not saying it's not true or factual. Certain myths are, well, more or less they carry a certain level of truth in it, and it needs facts to be quote unquote believed. But it is not, how do you say it is open to multiple interpretations, and it is not, how you say, what do you think? What else describes a myth?
A
Let
myth
me put it
is
back to you.
a myth. Again, I am going to cite Roland Barthes here for myths. A myth is a type of
Roman
speech.
parts.
So it's a type of speech. It's a mechanism. It's a discursive mechanism. It is distinct from truth and reality. That's something we agree on. But it is related to truth and reality. But then again, the relationship between myths and truth and reality, again, truth and reality are very complex. They are very complex. Any attempt to simplify truth and reality is necessary. It's part of human understanding. Human understanding cannot occur without a level of simplification. But a myth is conscious or deliberate attempt to simplify, and in doing so, it distorts. It distorts truth and reality.
Right.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
It does not hide anything. That's the curious thing about the myth. It doesn't hide, but it distorts. So, and it is something deployed. It is a conveyor of meaning and values. So,
Right.
I think the question, whenever we would try to analyze myths, so I think for our listeners, just to clarify before you start throwing rocks at us, when we call EDSA a myth, I think the question is not about whether it's true or false, whether it's fact or fiction. That is a question for history. But for myths, the question would be what is being conveyed and how it is being conveyed. I think that's the more
Right.
crucial problem.
And basically, a myth, just like the vernacular deployment of the word myth, it's a story. It's a story that is, it's a story about an event that happened, and it kind of orders and structures how we interpret that said event, and technically how we order and organize our society. Because technically, what can be called like the order that followed it. After the revolution, they established the 1987 constitution, known as the Freedom Constitution, which was an antithesis to the martial law constitution. What do you mean by that? It established a more robust Bill of Human Rights. Even if I'm not mistaken, they created the Commission on Human Rights just make sure there's no, just make sure there's no violation of human rights, right? Writ of habeas corpus, shorter presidential terms, freedom, and all other forms of democratic freedoms that are standard to quote unquote functional democracies. So it produced something laudable, that a lot of potential for Philippine democracy, and it is
Mm.
emblematic, and it is part of the Philippine imagination, and also what it means to be a Philippine democracy. When you say Philippine democracy, automatically think of the EDSA People Power Revolution.
Mm.
But what is the problem with this? Like, what do you think about that interpretation? You know, when it is so
Mm.
embedded into it, like, what's the problem that emerged? Because
Yeah,
it's not obviously it's not all good things after EDSA. You know, clearly
mm.
there we still have
Yeah.
problems. So what happened
Uh,
after?
yeah, I think that that's one clue. So
Mm-hmm.
the myth of EDSA can only be analyzed based on what happened next. So after the event, it is also judged based on what happened simultaneously with EDSA. So again, the story. That's one thing. EDSA as a myth, again as a myth, I would not blame it. It is its function. Function of a
Mm-hmm.
myth is to exclude. It's part of
Mm-hmm.
simplifying and distorting. That's why, yes, there are pockets of similar acts of protest in other parts of the country. But if you would look at the solid north, it is a solid north. If you would look at other parts of the Philippines, such mass movements did not occur. They are to an extent excluded from the story of EDSA.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
excluded. They're excluded from the event itself, but again,
Right.
the myth itself was formed as if EDSA was for them.
Help allow me to test that a bit.
Mm.
All right. Let's consider compared to, well, you might not agree with this comparison, but let's say, for instance, the American Revolution, and it was
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
comprised
Okay.
mostly of the early colonial
Mm.
states,
Mm.
and not all of the 50 states existed yet, and
Mm.
yet all 50 states presumably
Mm.
still continue to look at the quote unquote foundational myth of the
Mm.
American Revolution. So it excluded, particularly people that that didn't exist yet, but
Mm.
still, people still ident- identify with that founding. So what's the
Yeah.
difference? Does it matter if who it excludes?
Yeah. I think what matters would be the type of people who were excluded. The type
Mm-hmm.
of people who were excluded. Are they powerful enough? Are they powerful enough? Are they numerous enough to reject
Mm-hmm.
the myth? And I think that is what
Right.
separates the American Revolution, the foundational myth of the American Revolution, even the French Revolution, with the EDSA People Power Revolt. Because
Mm-hmm.
again, the founding myths of the United States, it took some time before it was established, but it was anchored on solid individual contributions. You have key entities like
Mm-hmm.
George Washington, John Adams, who embodied what an American is, the notion of an American nation. So then you have also Thomas Jefferson. But then again, debates came in. The myth was
Mm-hmm.
formed through time. But the
Mm-hmm.
people who were excluded were British loyalists who fled to Canada. That's basically it. And of
Right.
course, Negroes were excluded from that American myth. And that's another issue that they settled eventually with the Civil War.
Right.
So, but in the
And who were excluded
Philippines,
from EDSA? So yeah,
yeah,
and
who
they're
works.
so the people excluded were EDSA were still quite powerful. You're saying, like,
Yeah,
for
they are.
example.
They're numerous enough. The pro-Marcos sectors, the autocratic sectors, the illiberal sectors, the inactive sectors. They're the ones
Mm-hmm.
who were not part of the event. And
Right.
eventually, the thing is, the myth was formed to try to absorb them. So eventually, I think the story goes EDSA is for democracy for the entire Philippines. Am I right? That's the story usually. It's for everyone. But the problem is they're powerful enough and they are bullheaded enough to reject such
Right.
claims.
Here, one, of course, people power here. Yeah, it's almost presumed that people, almost everyone in Metro Manila was a part of it, even though factually that's not true. But still, okay. Let's try to break this down a little bit. First of
Mm,
all,
mm,
we've established that, well, people, it refers to a particular segment of the people, not all the people.
yeah, that's
What about, let's go for the next one? Okay, of
mm,
course, EDSA, just
yeah.
for everyone, it's the Epifanio de los Santos Road, the main road in
Avenue.
Quezon City Avenue. Yeah, yeah, it's the main road where it all happened.
Mm,
And of course, it was filled with people, but only a certain set of people, with a set of following a set of political actors. Um, is it a revolution? It's, I think, we've been discussing this for days,
mm.
and
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
you tend to like be hesitant to call it a revolution, even in this recording. Why is that the case? Is it a revolution or is it not?
Let us judge a revolution not
Mhm.
based on the people constituting it, but
Mhm.
based on its impacts, its eventual results. A revolution is
Mm.
always something fundamental, meaning fundamental
Mm.
structures were affected, were changed, and that's what a revolution is. And as far as measurement is concerned, as far as history is concerned, the only thing that they
Mhm.
changed really was first and foremost who's the new oligarchy, who's the ruling oligarchy. So you have the old
Mhm.
oligarchy coming back, and then you have constitutional
Mm.
changes. Now, if you
Right.
would count the constitution as something fundamental, then fine, fine. You can call it a revolution if the constitution for you is fundamental. But
Mhm.
laws, as Friedrich Hayek said, laws are mere mummies. No, no, not Friedrich Hayek, but Alexandre Kojev. Laws are but mere mummies of actual politics.
All
So,
right. Point taken. That it is the old oligarchs that returned after Marcos. But take
yeah,
note,
yeah.
they're same in person, but are they the same actors? The way that technically, did they still act the same, or did they learn from Marcos? Technically, I think they weren't the same. I mean, they were the same persons, but not.
Mm,
They didn't. That the way they adjusted their
mm,
methodology. So even then, we have to, how you say, nuance that. They are.
mm.
They. I think even from Marcos, so they made their methods more sophisticated. Don't you agree?
To an
Hence,
extent, yeah,
ABS-CBN,
yeah,
proliferates that narrative, and I think
yeah.
that's because it is well, it benefits them to believe that they're the good guys. Especially they're an oligarch
Mm.
persecuted by the Marcoses. And when they return, it's still quote unquote an oligarch.
Yeah, but then
Hence,
again,
yeah,
we're talking about something fundamental.
more
Their
radical.
their behavior doesn't
Mhm.
negate old structures of power. It is not. It's not
Mm,
an abandonment of old
mm,
structures of power. Hence, the massacre that occurred under Aquino's regime
mm.
of
The
farmers vying
this
for land reform.
Hacienda Luisita, if I'm not
Yeah,
correct. If I'm
Hacienda
correct, yeah.
Luisita, the protesters were Mendiola massacre, if I'm not mistaken.
I think,
So
wait, is the Mendiola the same thing? I think it happened before.
no,
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 let's
no, no.
focus on that Hacienda Luisita.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Hacienda Luisita, yeah, the
Uh,
Hacienda Luisita farmers who were massacred
right.
during a protest.
The Hacienda Luisita, of course, for those who don't know, are like farmers in a plantation that belong to the Aquinos, the
Coancos,
Aquino family in
Coancos, I think.
Coancos, sorry, which is related to the Aquinos.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, they were hoping for land reform, asking for
Mm.
their own land. They didn't give it, and instead were greeted with a rain of bullets. So
Yep.
that is in the shadow of EDSA. Like, of course, some people say that it was another set of oppressive oligarchs instead of
Mm.
just Marcos. So, yeah. So that is one interpretation of that. Anything else regarding the point in revolution?
Regarding is it a revolution or not?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it depends on how funda- it depends on someone's list of fundamental things. I have my own list of
Right.
fundamental political structures.
Mm.
If someone has a very
Mm-hmm.
shallow list, then fine, call it a revolution. But I have higher standards.
Higher standards. Is it possible to have higher standards but still call it a revolution?
No.
In other words, you don't believe it. You outright disagree.
Yeah.
Now because it's, how do we say this? It's not necessarily always well. One thing that EDSA did bring at the very least is the possibility of people participating and actually quote unquote enacting change, albeit with the assistance of
Mm,
key actors. Like, of
mm,
course, that's taken into account
mm.
Enrile, Ramos,
Ugh.
the Aquino, Cory Aquino, Cardinal Sin, funny name for a priest, who was a mobilizer. The church played a mobilizing force for democracy, of all things.
he.
Various sectors of civil society not only were formed and mushroomed
Mm.
uh, before People Power, but technically our civil society blossomed
Yeah.
like just preceding it. So I
Yeah.
suppose the events leading to EDSA revolution can be called well, I wouldn't say outright radically different as what you'd say, but definitely formative of our current of our current regime. And if it did not happen, we would not have the kind of regime we have now, which is, albeit okay, nominally liberally democratic, with all its flaws. We still have elections, more or less. We still have a freedom of speech. We still, in terms of, it was at the very least a setup to the political and economic order, which during the 90s is the beginning of setting up the Philippines' new place in the global economic order. It's not a strong place, but it is a, how you say, extractive place.
It is a
Like
transition. Let's just call it that. It is a
it's a
transition.
transition. Yeah,
Simple as that. I would agree. It is a
EDSA People
transition.
Power transition. Yeah.
Yeah, Jesus. It's a revolt because there's a mass behind it. It's a transition
Right.
because there's level of change. I will not use the word revolution
And
because I want to keep its value. You keep on using revolution, you would wear it out.
Okay, so how would you distinct? Well, of course, can you at least agree that the change was significant in the EDSA People Power?
The change was not significant. The change
In what
was
sense?
change as it is. It is as it is. Change regarding the level of change. I think it's just it's a change of quality really than intensity.
What do you mean?
Well, first and foremost, yes, civil society blossomed, but are civil society organizations capable of influencing policy process in an optimal manner? As far as I'm concerned, NGOs were even
optimal
subjected to
manner.
corruption, to abuses.
Right.
So again, I have high standards for fundamental change. Simple as
And
that.
what are those standards? Like, give us an example of
Well,
a revolution.
civil society organizations, well, let's just try to look at an alternative history for the Philippines. Civil society organizations having actual decision-making powers, if not having actual clout
Well, this seems
in the
like a bit
Congress.
of a hypothetical. How about a historical example of a successful revolution?
Okay, let's go to the French Revolution, where you just cut off nobility, the heads of the noblemen. That's radical enough. Another radical thing about the French Revolution would be the change in the economic structure, which more or less was disastrous, but still.
From that disaster, they managed to create a republic, and
Yeah.
the new economic order.
But
So,
then
yeah.
let's go to the American Revolution. American Revolution. The formation of an American identity is fundamental because they never had it before. It is the beginning of something new to have an American identity and to even have a central government, thanks to Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
And to have a constitution that can balance out state interest and national interest. So those are beginnings that are not present in that area, but the potentials were there, meaning the results were optimal. Let's just put it that way. The results were optimal.
Right. Well, as a result, I would agree that revolution could have been like, it's more of a cosmetic and branding name than an actual revolution. Revolution takes a certain level of radical change, as what you've said. I would say that yes, the change. I'd say the change would be significant, but not necessarily enough for a revolution. A lot of things were rearranged, but not this. How do you say this? I wonder. I suppose the test of time, at least, for both revolutions, French and America. The kind of change they wanted, the foundation, how do you say it? The space for freedom that they tried to establish still withstood the test of time. Whereas in the Philippines right now, the fact that we have another
Autocrat.
dictator, another autocrat in power, means that the values of what EDSA represented are losing its power, even among those people who used to believe it. Take note that while there are a lot of people that did not believe it in the first place, there are also people who did believe it but lost it. And hence, there's this phenomenon called EDSA fatigue, coined by Professor Julio Tihanki, one of our senior colleagues. Yeah.
Who argues that it's a fatigue for him is people who are getting tired of the EDSA story that is revolving around the Aquinos. But okay, you know what? I'll try to be a bit more optimistic. The thing is, EDSA, I will not call EDSA as a revolution because I think, first and foremost, it is not yet over. On one hand, that I can entertain that possibility. On the other hand,
like it's on life support but not dead. Yeah.
more of the seeds are planted. There are seeds that are planted. There are potentials that were opened. And I do agree, civil society blossomed after EDSA. Freedoms were guaranteed, but I will not call it a revolution because the political structures in place are keeping those potentials into mere potentials, into minimal efforts for democratization. They are stopping such potentials from growing.
Right. In fact, we don't blame the people who were there at that moment. I'm sure it felt magical. I'm sure it felt important at the time.
It was.
But the decisions, the important, it was important. But the decisions made after that kind of turned that, at the same time, that event made almost anything possible. But as soon as those doors opened, immediately certain things were closed. Like people expected land reform. That didn't happen because it was in the seat of power is another landed oligarch.
I think EDSA as a revolt created a rupture. The rupture was big enough for the old oligarchy to come in, but it was not big enough to empower actual civil society organizations in the long run. So, and again, Cardinal Sin is pivotal in this entire. I cannot. Let me just emphasize Cardinal Sin's sin against EDSA.
Okay.
His decision to integrate those two autocrats into the movement, Enrile and FBR, his decision to protect them was both the trigger. Again, it was the trigger for the revolt itself, but it also killed its long-term potential because these are two oligarchs. These two people were behind martial law. They were trying to whack the same people that they mingled around during EDSA.
I mean, it's opportunistic and it was smart for the short term because the cosmetic or the aesthetic decision to add former enemies into the fold would give a morale boost and enough energy for EDSA to come into fruition. But you said, that's what you said in the long run. Yeah, the fact that you enter a bit of the old order into it, it began to sabotage the movement itself. Interesting. The more you know history, the more you know, right?
Again, Enrile became a senator, eventually became a senator after leading another coup d'etat against Cory Aquino. That's one thing. So there are seeds. The seeds of the autocratic regime of Marcos remain.
That's funny. Especially, I think the EDSA myth deployment, I think, had its, I would say, golden age or at its peak when Corazon Aquino, the original face of EDSA, died, and her son Benigno Aquino III, Noy Noy, was able to create convert the EDSA myth into political capital, hence getting him into the presidency. And during that time, if you remember, I was a freshman, and I remember people were asking me about political opinions already, but I noticed politically a lot of things were going on. If you remember, Bench had a lot of Ninoy Aquino, his father, and Corazon Aquino things. They were almost there were a lot of shirts and paraphernalia. There's even a Benigno Aquino scent. My God, it's a commercialization of the EDSA myth, And there was also a lot of the literature on EDSA itself is actually quite saturating, have you heard, have you read some of them?
No.
EDSA as a eyewitness report.
No. I think I read some articles on it, which is fine. That actually increased my appreciation of what actually happened during EDSA from the perspective of the masses. One thing I think it is Huling Buga is the last grand gasp of the EDSA myth because again 2010 Noynoy Aquino won, 2013.
How was his actual presidency?
No, it's not about the actual presidency. I would suspend judgment on it. But 2013, the Marcoses returned to national politics.
Bongbong Marcos was elected senator.
Bongbong Marcos was elected as senator. That was just 3 years after the 2010 election. And even the 2010 election, you have the likes of Estrada gaining second place in the elections. So, Huling Buga, it's the last gasp of the EDSA narrative, the supposed hegemony of it. But
I mean, the funny thing is, the thing is, it it also spawned, like, like we said, spin-offs, EDSA 2 and EDSA 3. EDSA 2 was when they reused and like a tired sequel, same actors more or less, but eventually they just installed like another woman. It's funny. Gloria Arroyo, to expose someone who wasn't. I mean, for all his flaws, he wasn't as bad as Marcos by any stretch of the imagination. And shortly after, EDSA Tres. Well, we'll talk about that in another thing. But
another
EDSA
episode.
Tres, EDSA Tres is like they want the urban poor stormed
Malacanang.
Malacanang because they wanted Estrada back in power. So it's like a counter EDSA movement. So it muddied the the actual story of EDSA. So that's what made, in hindsight, problematic all the more. I mean, I'm not saying that their sentiments are invalid. It's just that the stark contrast between the first two EDSAs and this one was just too great. Anything to say about that?
Yeah, that's the thing. You know what? I would also connect it with the eventual return of Bongbong Marcos to Marcos's national politics. Again, these are marks of a tendencies that were ignored when this myth, this narrative was being peddled. This illiberal, to an extent, populist tendencies, they were at the margins, they were at the shadow. And again, you know what? Ignoring a shadow doesn't nullify its existence. Let's just put it that way. For years, scholars have ignored the presence of autocratic and illiberal tendencies. Well, ignoring it doesn't really make it go away. It just grew under our noses. So you know what? Way back in 2013, I predicted that we will have another autocrat. I actually wrote a small article on it, pickling a dictator. So I said that if Bongbong Marcos returned 2013, I analyzed that the Filipinos would have these tendencies. Another dictator would come around soon, and lo and behold, 2016 happened. So again, myths. In order for myths to gain hegemony, they must exclude those who cannot resist.
Or in other words, if I can reframe it, include as many of the powerful as possible.
Yeah, to an extent. Yeah, to an extent. Or empower the ones who are already included. Yeah, that's another thing.
EDSA didn't do that.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Well, and how did they not do that? I mean, they did empower certain EDSA thing. Yeah.
Again, the CSOs, they blossomed. That's one thing. They multiplied
in number.
And there are those who are still mobilizing and organizing along liberal democratic lines. I will not.
Right.
I don't disagree with their presence. Of course, their presence is invaluable for democracy. But again, the structures are in place. Can they affect policy making? Can they affect law making? That's a great question.
Case-to-case basis, but mostly
no.
It depends on what the well, not by themselves, but more or less it depends if they're allied with higher office with the president. So yeah, that it's all dependent on higher who's in power, not by themselves. It just if they're, I don't know. I think this is more. We have a mutual friend who might speak more of this, but yeah, it still depends. They can affect and play a role, but not by their own choosing.
And that's the problem. I mean, that's problematic. That is not an optimal condition.
Right. And so I think we can talk about all these problematic legacies of the. Honestly, you won't spend judgment. I think that the Aquino administration, both Aquino administrations, were suboptimal.
Well, that's
in fact, that is my judgment I'm willing to make.
Okay, fine.
I said they were suboptimal. I didn't say they were terrible, suboptimal. 2.0 in the grade pamagrado. But average, yeah. No, but they kept things together, but it wasn't as good as it could have been. But we can talk about that all day long, much more. But just to perhaps give us a close, we know that it's a myth, and we know that it's created all these symptoms and all these problematic things, but also invaluable things, as we established. That even in real politique, it wasn't as powerful, or it wasn't as hegemonic. But for those people who were inspired, who grew up and came of age in the narrative EDSA, there are people who still believe in it, and
Mm.
people who lose faith in it. So at this crossroads of knowing that how the limits of the EDSA myth, like what
Yeah,
should
yeah, yeah.
we do? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What should we do? What should we do?
Mm-hmm.
But I think I have at least. Well, I need to make 3 points. Okay, 3 points.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first, I would like to again re-emphasize the importance of the stories we tell ourselves. Mythologies,
Mm-hmm.
even if they are simplifications, even if they are to an extent distortions, they are
Mm-hmm.
necessary in establishing a nation or a sense of community. So
Mm-hmm.
we are the stories we tell ourselves. So
Right.
Bernard Yack, Roger Smith, when they
Mm-hmm.
analyze
Right.
peoplehood, it's
Mm-hmm.
important for identity building, for political identity. How
Sure.
we identify ourselves depend on the stories we tell.
Mm-hmm.
Second point, we must recognize that myths have a lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
They can be durable, but they don't last forever. And the third point, and I think I would pose this as a challenge: can you find
Mm-hmm.
a new myth?
Mm-hmm.
Can we
A
find
new
a
myth.
can we
Mm-hmm.
create a new myth that
Mm-hmm.
more or less, again, the EDSA myth is a generational thing. We must recognize that
Right.
it is for a certain generation. And I
Mm-hmm.
go by the dictum that one generation does not have the right to impose their will on another generation the same way that tyrants don't have the right to impose themselves on a certain people. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a generational gap. There's value in it,
Mm-hmm.
but we must again pin it
Mm-hmm.
to the generation. So it's a challenge for the new generation.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a myth? Do we have
Mm-hmm.
a myth? So I think we had some small
Right.
myths. We had the
Mm-hmm.
Robredo mystique of
Mm-hmm.
the late Jesse Robredo and his advances on participatory democracy in Naga. So
Which is a
that's
spin-off of the EDSA myth, actually, in a sense.
yeah,
They
that
still co-opted the yellow color, actually.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That to an extent is a mini myth because again,
Mini
Robredo.
myth.
Yeah, because again, Jesse Robredo is part of the old elite. So, but then again, he was
Right.
democratic. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something that is usually ignored in the stories. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's
Right.
fine. It is a myth. It has its own values. But we
Right.
also have now the Duterte myth.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. What about the Duterte myth?
It's just a myth.
Oh, well, for one thing, the myth that he is a savior, that
Mm,
violence is necessary for our society,
mm,
uh, despite its failures, like currently
mm.
both his police forces, like the drug authority and the Quezon City Police, both fired upon each other because of
Yeah,
lack of planning. If you've heard that news,
yeah,
so
yeah,
clearly
yeah.
that's emblematic on
Putang ina yun.
in the failure of. I'll say it right now. It's a failure of
Like,
the drug war and the police state that
eh,
we are in.
condolences to those who lost their lives, but god damn, that's stupid.
It's stupid. It's almost funny. We try not to laugh, but it's kind of funny.
It's tragic.
Uh,
It's tragic comic.
well,
Something you
it's
see on comic books.
hmm but of course, it's still not dying despite failure. In fact, if anything, people are doubling down. And right now, Sara Duterte, his daughter, is still has a strong chance of running for president in 2022. That's next year.
Yeah.
That's so close. Yeah.
Ew.
Yeah. So, so myths are inevitable.
Yeah.
Myths are necessary. I think you and I agree with that.
Yes. Yes, I do.
But the thing is, perhaps we can somewhat diverge
Mm,
in the way we reflect on myths. I do agree that we need to reflect on the meaning of the myth, but the thing is, we cannot. I think you and I both agree that
mm.
EDSA cannot be ignored. It is a part of our history. It is part
Yep.
of our story, with
Mm,
all its flaws and with all its value.
mm,
It is part of a, but I think it's still, we have to reflect. In order for us to move on from EDSA, in a
mm,
sense, we have to know what to take with us and what to leave behind.
mm,
I think almost every book and documentary, Facebook post, YouTube video, tweet can tell you that it's not a perfect paradise. It's not a
mm,
romantic story. It's flawed.
mm, mm,
But what can we take away from it? I think, in a level of abstraction, we know that people can fight against a dictator. People value
mm,
freedom.
mm,
Of course, and it is a genuine expression of a
mm,
sentiment of a significant section of society. It's not the whole
mm,
Philippines, but a
mm,
significant section.
mm,
And if ever there's any hope that we can move forward, we still have to recycle it and revive it in such a way,
mm,
that we can all move forward together.
mm,
As personally, I've mentioned to you this before. I'm
Mm.
sympathetic of liberal values, and uh, people power is
Mm.
an expression of that. I know of
Mm.
people
Mm.
pushing back against tyranny, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's something that resonated it with other countries as well.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
could have easily been, I don't want to say it, another Tiananmen or something, or it could have.
Yeah, it could have been.
They were faced tanks.
It could have
They
been
faced.
because yeah,
Yeah.
technically it could have been because the loyal
Hmm.
units, the units who were loyal to Marcos are about
Hmm.
to arrive in Manila.
Hmm.
They just
Right.
arrived too late.
Hmm. But the fact is, like, you can say how it's all there are certain tricks, there are certain
Mm.
things backstage, but the important thing is that it happened.
Mm.
It happened,
Yeah.
and so won. It's a story of the where the people, well,
Mm.
however you call it, won. And I
Yeah.
think that's one thing that's important. People can
Mm.
win.
Yeah.
We've been like, kind of obsessed with the history of EDSA, and that's not
Mm.
necessarily wrong.
Mm.
But when we go for the history, it's like saying, like, you look at the picture or a painting of something
Mm.
beautiful, and then when people do is they zoom in and zoom in. Oh, look at that crack! That painting is cracked. Oh, look at that! That the ear is really big and misshapen and uneven. But in a way, in order for you to appreciate, you have to move a step back,
Mm.
see the bigger picture. It has these problems, but it also did a lot of things, like the new
Mm.
constitution, like what I said,
Mm.
civil society, the church as a
Mm.
player in democracy, which hardly
Mm.
ever happens, but it happened here. Well, I'd say the church, but we really mean Cardinal Sin and the CBCP at that time. Now, it's out. The jury is out on that. But
Mm.
at that time, the church was an actor for democracy.
Mm.
So I suppose, and here's the thing: even if we don't need to abandon the myth, because it can be a part of a larger myth
Mm.
of the
Mm.
story of the Filipino people.
Mm.
Because myths aren't always about victories; they're also about defeats, rising and falling.
Mm.
If you want to include the story of EDSA 1, 2, and 3, and how it is, in a sense, a parody of the
Mm.
first, or a pale imitation, you
Mm.
have to learn from that. But here's the thing: we cannot necessarily drop it as part of the myth of the Philippine nation. It's funny, if you remember this line from
Mm.
Lord of the Rings. There's this thing called, she says that history becomes legend and legend becomes myth.
Yeah.
History and myth are inextricably tied. But when does history become
Wait, wait,
myth?
wait, wait. They are
That's an
tied.
interesting question. Yeah, they are tied. But
They are
when does
tied.
history become myth?
The thing is, okay,
Mm-hmm.
probably to highlight what
Mm-hmm.
your argument regarding the
Mm-hmm.
importance of myth and
Mm-hmm.
the inevitability of having a myth, and we need
Mm-hmm.
not abandon it as a myth.
Right.
Well, I
Mm-hmm.
do disagree. We need to find a new myth. But
Mm-hmm.
since it stays, since it's here to stay, you know what the great paradox is?
Mm-hmm.
The current attempts, the current efforts right now to demystify EDSA are diluting its power.
Mm-hmm.
So, your question regarding where's the line between history and myth, demystify myth, it becomes history. And when it is
Mm-hmm.
demystified, it loses its power. The thing is,
Right.
this is something implied in our discussion right now, but I'll bring it up just to piss off people. Power
Mm-hmm.
is not located in truth. It is not located
Mm-hmm.
in facts. There's no power in truth and facts. The human mind rejects truth and facts as long as they have biases. But
Mm-hmm.
power is located in the myths that we create, we form, and we convey, because these are the ones that
Mm-hmm.
are appealing to our biases.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So let's
Mm-hmm.
just put it that way.
Well, Well, I have to disagree on that, because I say there is power in truth. I'm not saying it's
Yeah.
always more powerful than lies,
It depends on how
but
you handle
truth
truth.
is. Oh yeah, no, truth is
Hmm.
power. Truth is powerful. In
Depends on
fact,
how you handle it.
when here's the thing: when you tell a lie, eventually it unravels. Eventually, the truth. The saying, the truth will set you free. The truth eventually emerges. Nothing that is hidden will
Yeah, it
eventually
will set you
remain.
free.
It will see set light. That's it.
Doesn't necessarily give you
That's it.
power. It just gives you freedom.
No. See, here's the thing: when you say power, it means what people can possess. But in a sense, truth is its own power. In other words, human beings, like, the truth is so powerful, human beings can't completely wield it. It doesn't even have
Okay.
agency. It's just is.
There's no power. Okay, Socrates bore truth. Did he have power? No, he ended up dead. He was free. He was free, but
And yet we're still
he
talking about Socrates and
and
not the
now,
people who killed him.
but
Well,
during his time,
we're talking
he
about
was
Socrates.
powerless.
Yeah.
He was powerless during that
You're
time.
talking about political power, but not
Yes, I am
like
political. I'm talking about political
power.
power, and to an extent,
Yeah.
power as
Well,
well. You
I'll,
know, the
I'll
thing is,
admit that.
yeah, for
No. Mm,
Machiavelli, power lies in the actual
mm,
truth. What is the actual truth? It's the truth
mm,
that have an effect on things. So, I would admit, fine, truth may have
mm,
measure of power, but it depends on how you handle it. Does it actually
mm,
affect conditions?
mm, mm. Well, the thing is, if you could say it this way, a lie made by a man, the limits of that power, that's when the the power of the truth begins, technically.
What?
Don't you agree?
Depends on how long can you hold
When
on to the
when
lie.
a lie of a man, huh?
Depends on how long can you hold on to the
When a
lie.
lie, hmm, here's the thing: no one can hold on to a lie forever, can it?
Hmm?
Can they? And I suppose that's where the power of the truth begins. You know, I mean, the point that when Machiavelli, well, the thing about Machiavelli is, and you say his name over, but one thing that he recognized is there is fortuna, things that you cannot control. I suppose that is the truth that I'm talking about. The limits of what virtue can do or what man can control
Uh,
is
that
precisely the limitations of power, like of the power of the lie or power of what man
that's
can
that's
make.
not that's not really truth. Those are changing conditions. You cannot you cannot have complete power over change. That's one thing we can agree
Well,
on.
here's the thing. What do you mean by truth? Because technically, what people can conceive as the truth is something that exists and that cannot be affected by the lie. It's something that cannot be controlled or unchanging, regardless of what people say about it.
But
It
does it
is
give power?
is the truth. Hmm?
Does it give power to someone?
Yeah. Well, yes.
Mm,
And
mm,
it's the same thing in the way you handle the lie. It depends on how you handle the truth. But here's the thing: the truth is powerful regardless of how people handle it. The truth is the truth. But anyway,
yeah,
this
people
is
how people
another
handle it.
like abstract thing. But here's what I want to close on here: is that history becomes myth when we try to extract from history moral values. What is important to society? What is important for the nation? And at least when we choose a certain event to be important with it, we have to identify what what in it do we want to promote and keep alive. And I think at least from the people power effect, I think you and I can
Hmm.
agree that it is the power of the collective and the multiple of the people. You know, it may not be all the people, but it is the people
That.
and the failure
Hmm.
and the rejection of authoritarianism. I think that is a value that is worth making a myth
Yeah.
out of. We can't take the story or history, all of it. We just take what's important, extract like maybe a moral lesson.
Yeah. That's the
Yeah.
thing. In doing so,
Mm-hmm.
it is necessary. In
Mm-hmm.
doing so, you need to distort and you need to
Mm-hmm.
ignore certain historical facts. For example, if you would say that
Mm-hmm.
the people power revolution embodies democratic values, then you are forced to ignore that FVR and really were autocrats and they're the ones mingling around the crowd. So yeah, and then you
Mm-hmm.
need to ignore that there are oligarchs in the entire event. So it is inevitable
Mm-hmm.
that you need to
Mm-hmm.
distort and you need to simplify in order to
Mm-hmm.
extract a moral value. But it is a value nevertheless.
Mm-hmm. And here's the thing: if we were trying to build a polity, we need examples or at
Hmm.
least demonstrations of civic value, and we have to have, at
Hmm.
the very least, we need to have that conversation. And
Hmm.
in a way, it's from studying history. We have to study
Hmm.
history, but at the end of the day, we have to pick out
Hmm.
what are our society's morals. And I suppose that is the conversation that we have to continue as a nation together. Not just in this podcast, but hopefully
Hmm.
with our listeners eventually.
Eventually.
Whew. Anything else to add before we go on to recommendations? No.
Uh, I think this would be enough for tonight. Lest we
This
saturate
episode.
our viewers, because
Right.
we would
So,
eventually end up with the struggle between truth, reality, and myth.
mhm. All right. Which Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris took them like days or months. But yeah, we are no longer near their level. But really, yeah, I think for now it's important for a polity building. I think this is enough. right?
Morality.
Morality, yeah, I suppose. So it's having a conversation about national morality, and it's the
Mm.
rejection of authoritarianism and the acceptance of, peaceful struggle. All right, I think we should acknowledge that
Mm.
the
Freedom.
miraculous quality of it. Yeah, to freedom. Yeah.
Miraculous is that's you imbibing the myth talking right now. Miraculous.
Mm, yeah. Well, we'll have this. We'll continue this conversation, but for now, let's move on to recommendations. Where we recommend materials. It could be books, movies, or whatever that can help continue this conversation. So, what do you have for us this week, Board?
Yeah, I do have something, something a bit
Mm,
curious.
mm,
It was written back in 1990, I think. No, it was
right.
written back in 1995, so it was relatively close to the. So the
Mm,
title would be the Economics of People Power.
mm-hmm.
The economic democracy through the parliament of the marketplace by Maximo
Right.
Indolos. This is an examination of extending people power or the value of people power as a
Mm-hmm.
democratic movement to economics.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically
All right.
it explores the potentials for building
Mm-hmm.
economic democracy in the Philippines via cooperative movements and of course having a market that is more or less partially Keynesian, more
Mm-hmm.
Keynesian approach to things.
Mm,
But yeah,
mm-hmm. Well, is that it? So at least we know that the well, the people power did make people rich and made people poor.
yeah, but
So,
Indolos
mhm,
tried to transfer the values of people power
mhm,
to
right.
economics, which is still struggle right now.
Mm. And how can we form a better myth from, in a way, this material about economics?
Well, it's not really a myth. It's basically an idea that
Mm-hmm.
democracy, in order for
Mm-hmm.
democracy to work, it must
Right.
encompass both politics and
Right.
economics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. For me, I have two recommendations. First off, well, I don't think it has neither of my recommendations have
Mm.
people power EDSA in it. And the thing is, I agree that we've been overly saturated, and in order for you to solve this fatigue, not only do you have to have a proper conversation about it, but I think you have to
Mm.
avoid those people that zoom in on EDSA too much. And one remedy is to have a history book that uh, it contextualizes EDSA before and after, the events that led to it and the events that followed. And as a regular practice, even I continue to reread this book every day. Well, not every day, but every now and then.
I.
Every now and then, all right? I'm not a nerd. Oh, well, I'm not a super nerd. Anyway,
Oh yeah, we
it's
already know that.
yeah, it's State and Society in the Philippines by Patricio Abinales and Amoroso.
Ah, okay.
And I think it's good. And here's the thing: there's a chapter in EDSA, and it's a very good account. But it also has, of course, when you read EDSA, like the part in EDSA, you know that right before it, things happen. That's the martial law. Before that, and so on. And there's things that happen after it. So I think it's a good to. So like remember in episode, what was that, episode 5, part 1, it's important to know the whole story from episode 1, like 1
Mm.
to 6 or 1 to whatever. I think that's the important part. So
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, it recognizes EDSA was important, but you also see it in the context of the whole picture of the Philippine nation. So that's
Mm.
a remedy for fatigue. Recognize it as an important part of our history, even part of our myth, but at the same time, see it as part of a whole story. So yeah, so it could be a part of a greater myth as in the Philippines that we
Mm.
can still need to continue to construct. And the other is, well, it's not even about Philippines, it's about Angels in America. Now,
Mm.
there are many stagings from this available. There's HBO's one starring Meryl Streep and Al Pacino,
That was
and
nice.
the newer one, which was, I think it involved. There are many stagings, but it involves
Andrew Garfield.
what's his name, Andrew Garfield. Oh, you watched that too? Okay,
Dude,
cultured.
yeah.
Yeah, we both watched it. Yeah, and the thing is, it's well, what does this have to do? It's
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
a
yeah.
form of literature that is both critical and appreciative of its own country, which is America. There are characters that hate America but still continue to live in it, still to fight for it. There are people that love America but also recognize the flaws of that love for America. And it is also a reflection on the story that they tell themselves, and people having like the self-awareness saying, like, what do we really believe in this? Like, I remember this one particular scene that I kind of just appreciated on my second viewing. There was this the female character, the wife of I forgot his name.
Yeah,
The female character
was in the closet.
she,
The wife of the one who's in the closet. The Mormon.
yeah,
the wife of the
yeah,
Mormon.
the Mormon wife. My God, yeah, I forget. She basically went to the Mormon museum, and there were these animatronic characters, and they were retelling the story of the Mormon origin, how they founded the first communities in America, and all of a sudden they looked, and then they said, at the female animatronic, saying, "Why isn't she talking? I mean, she's right there. Why isn't she talking?" And that's in a way part of what's being ignored in certain myths. Some people speak in the certain myths, others are just in the background. There are voices ignored in certain myths. And at least in Angels in America, it is a myth in itself, but it is also one that is critical, but at the same time appreciative of the story of America. But overall, the message of Angels in America is to, in a way, move on, but not carelessly just move on by force. You still have, along the way, you still have to fight certain ghosts and shadows and myths, and incorporate them into your being. Incorporate the shadow. You don't repress the shadow like Freud, but you incorporate the shadow like Jung.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you think? You share that sentiment?
Regarding, I do share the sentiment, and that's very curious. That's very interesting. We should, I do advise that we also people should watch Angels of America. But you know what? Regarding integrating the shadow, that's where the EDSA regime failed. They repressed the shadow, and it came out in an uglier, more Duterte-esque figure.
I think we're very partisan this episode. My God.
Okay,
anyway,
I'll just lay down my
we're
biases.
still alive.
I'll just lay down my biases. Yeah.
Right. We need our own version of Angels in America. So yeah. Anyway, that is our super EDSA special edition.
Super EDSA special edition.
Yeah, of the PI podcast. Remember, help continue this conversation. Be critical. Keep reading about EDSA, but don't be enamored too much. Just find that core thing that we can keep about our myth, and then see what happens, or drop it completely. I don't know.
Nice.
Or think about it. Yeah, I'm sure board would like that. But
or find a new one.
Continue to write the story of the Philippines together. All right. So yeah, that's a long conversation. Hopefully you've learned a lot, and we probably dealt with a bit of historical angst in EDSA. Should be announced. We have new content. We're starting a new segment called PI Eskwela.
It would come out soon.
What is that?
It would come out soon.
Where we talk about in Tagalog, so of all things. And we talk about it in English. But you're going to hear us in Tagalog more often in PI Eskwela, where we teach and talk about basic concepts of politics. And we have we're reaching out to the podcast community. We won't say with who yet, but we're doing collaboration. So watch out for that. Yep. So thank you for joining us, and please keep in touch, subscribe, share it to your friends, email us, and keep watching for new content. But until then,
magandang gabi mga ka-PI.